The rain had not yet begun to fall on that October morning in 1884, but the clouds over New York had already turned the sky the color of slate. Somewhere behind those thick curtains of gray, a girl was born into a mansion with marble floors, velvet drapes, and voices that echoed like the wind through a canyon. Her name was Eleonora, though most would know her later as Eleanor. Elellanena, as she would sometimes sign her name in childish scrawl, as if trying to soften the edges of a life that rarely offered such tenderness. She came into a world of wealth. Yes, a world of gilded mirrors and high society salons, of names that commanded respect. The Roosevelts were not just another rich family, they were aristocracy. Old Dutch stock, landowners, politicians, and heirs to centuries of power. Yet even in the grandeur of this legacy, there were shadows that stretched long across the family name. And for little Elellanena, the shadows arrived early. They never left. Her mother, Anna Hall Roosevelt, was beautiful, staggeringly so. Men noticed her from across ballrooms. Women imitated the cut of her dresses, the tilt of her chin. But Anna's beauty was a cold thing. It had no warmth for her daughter. She saw in Elellanena something disappointing, a face too serious, too pale, too plain. "You have no charm," she would say, laughing lightly in front of guests. "You're just like a little grandmother." The nickname stuck. Granny, spoken with an affectionate sneer, the kind of mockery that lodges itself into the corners of a child's mind and blooms like mold. Her father, Elliot Roosevelt, was different. To Elellanena, he was a beacon, a gentle smile, a laughing voice, the only person who made her feel radiant simply by existing near him. He'd sweep her up in his arms, tell her she was lovely, smart, destined for something meaningful. But Elliot, like many men born into power, was fragile in all the wrong places. Handsome, charming, and drowning. He drank heavily. He disappeared for days. His mood swung like a pendulum. Warm, wild joy followed by crushing silence. She adored him, but he was slipping through her fingers long before death took him. The first blow came when she was just 8. Her mother, Anna, died of diphtheria. There was no dramatic farewell, just absence. The kind that echoes down long hallways, that lingers on the perfume-soaked handkerchiefs she left behind. 2 years later, her father followed, his body collapsing under the weight of drink and delusion in a distant asylum. One day, he was gone, and she was 10 years old, alone in a house that never really felt like hers. Orphaned, she was sent to live with her maternal grandmother, Mary Ludlow Hall, a strict woman, cold, Episcopalian to the bone. The days were governed by etiquette, the nights by silence. No one spoke of feelings. Grief was a private sin. You were expected to carry it like pearls around your neck, beautiful but strangling. In that rigid world, Elellanena began to disappear, to fold into herself like parchment. But grief in some people becomes the furnace of transformation. She read, not to pass time, but to escape it. Dickens, Eliot, Bronte, stories of other lonely girls navigating loveless homes. She understood them. She lived among them. In her mind, she built an interior castle, one room at a time, each lined with paper and ink. And within those walls, something stirred, something resilient, a quiet fire, the beginnings of the woman she would become. She was sent to Allenswood, a boarding school in England, when she was 15. It was a turning point, perhaps the first. The headmistress, Marie Souvestre, was unlike any woman Elellanena had ever met. French, sharp-tongued, fiercely intellectual, she saw the girl behind the silence, encouraged her, challenged her, and most importantly, believed in her. It was at Allenswood that Elellanena stood tall for the first time. Not physically, though her height had always been awkward, towering over other girls like an unanswered question, but inwardly. She began to speak in class, to question, to write essays that pulsed with moral conviction. She found her voice in Europe, and when she returned to New York, she brought with her something subtle but undeniable: purpose. But the world she returned to hadn't changed. The Roosevelts still moved in circles of opulence and scrutiny. And soon, her path crossed again with a distant cousin, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. He was charming, ambitious, eager to prove himself. Their courtship was quiet, partly due to family disapproval, partly due to Elellenane's own caution. Yet in 1905 they married. She was 20, he was 23. What did she see in him? Perhaps the same flicker of idealism that had once lived in her father. Perhaps the promise of partnership, of shared goals. Or perhaps she simply saw in him the possibility of relevance, not for herself, but for the world. Franklin was going places, and she was ready, even then, to follow the road wherever it might lead. But the road was long and cruel, and it did not offer her the kind of love she had longed for since childhood. The early years of their marriage were marked by children, yes, 6 in total, though only 5 survived. They were marked by political assent, by tea with power brokers, smiles on campaign trains, careful poses for the public. But behind the public life there was a fracture, a distance, and eventually a betrayal. In 1918, Eleanor discovered that Franklin was having an affair with her own social secretary, Lucy Mercer. The revelation was shattering, not just because of the affair itself, but because of what it confirmed. That she had never truly been seen, not fully by the man she'd built a life beside. She offered divorce. He refused. And in that moment, something in her shifted forever. She would stay married, but she would no longer be a wife in the traditional sense. She would be her own person. It was the beginning of her second life, the one that history remembers. But tell me, what kind of strength does it take to turn heartbreak into fuel, to turn silence into speeches, rooms of whispers into platforms of change? How many times does a woman have to be ignored before her voice becomes unstoppable? In the ashes of disappointment, Elellanena Roosevelt began to rise, not as a symbol, not as a figurehead, but as a force, and it all started, not with power, not with applause, but with a broken girl, in a cold house, dreaming herself out of oblivion. The world hadn't noticed her yet, but soon it would. There's a moment in every life when the world tilts, when the path once taken in quiet obedience fractures, and a different self steps forward from the shadows. For Elellanena Roosevelt, that moment had come. The discovery of Franklin's betrayal in 1918 was more than a private heartbreak. It was a funeral for the girl who had once waited for love to save her. What rose in her place was not cold or vengeful. She was something stranger, a woman no longer tethered to the illusions of marriage or the false comfort of tradition. She would live beside him, yes, but not beneath him. That was over. While Franklin recovered from polio just a few years later, his body paralyzed from the waist down by the merciless grip of the virus, Elellanena began to move in the opposite direction. She became unstoppable, untethered, unquiet. Did you know that sometimes, when a person loses everything they thought they needed, they become who they truly are? In the 1920s, Elellanena stepped into political life, not as an accessory to her husband, but as a voice in her own right. She joined the League of Women Voters, taught at the Todhunter School for Girls, became a leading member of the Women's Trade Union League. She gave speeches, not the practiced kind read from a husband's note cards, but lived searing truths. She spoke of sweatshops, of immigrant women burned alive in shirtwaist factories, of the poor held hostage by wealth in a country that prided itself on freedom. She didn't speak like a Roosevelt. She spoke like a witness. And yet, she was always watching, always listening, absorbing the currents of power and injustice like a wire draws lightning. Franklin's political star continued to rise, but it was Elellanena who became his eyes and ears across the country. When he could no longer walk, she became his legs, traveling to coal towns and slums, black churches and union halls, seeing what he could not, bringing back not just facts, but faces, stories, suffering. She was not merely collecting information. She was becoming the conscience of an administration that hadn't yet existed. But conscience is a heavy thing to carry alone. By the time the Great Depression gripped the nation in the early 1930s, Franklin had returned to public life in full force. Elected as governor of New York, and then nominated as the Democratic candidate for president. Behind the speeches and the fanfare, Elellanena stood, tall, composed, wary. The campaign trail was familiar ground by now, but she was not content to smile for photographs. She spoke at rallies. She challenged reporters. She refused to fade into the background. And when Franklin was elected in 1932, the press asked the question on everyone's mind. What kind of first lady would she be? What they meant was, would she behave? No first lady before her had been like this. They hosted luncheons, gardened, waved from balconies. But Elellanena had no interest in embroidery. She brought her own secretary, her own agenda. She held press conferences, for women only, forcing newspapers to hire female journalists for the first time. She wrote a daily newspaper column, My Day, chronicling not fashion or White House gossip, but the plight of the unemployed, the discrimination against Black Americans, the condition of mining towns and sharecroppers. Her column was read by millions. She walked into prisons, visited Japanese-American internment camps. She went to Harlem, not as a guest, but as an ally. She shook hands with those long kept outside the halls of power and listened without condescension. And when the hate came, as it always does for a woman who will not lower her voice, she absorbed it in silence. She had known cruelty since childhood. What could they say that hadn't already been whispered by her own mother? In 1939, one of the most defining moments of her public life unfolded not in a legislative chamber or at a summit, but on the steps of Constitution Hall. The Daughters of the American Revolution had banned the world-renowned black singer Marian Anderson from performing because of the color of her skin. They called it policy. Elellanena called it cowardice. She resigned from the DR publicly, and then she arranged something no one expected. On Easter Sunday, April 9, 1939, Marian Anderson stood in front of the Lincoln Memorial, erected to a man who had died for the ideal of unity, and sang to a crowd of over 75,000. Her voice rose into the spring air like a summons, echoing across the National Mall, into the veins of a broken nation. Behind the curtain of that performance, Elellanena stood, not for applause, but for justice. Can you imagine what it takes to put your name, your body, your legacy on the line? Not in secret, but openly, in a country that had never truly decided whether a woman had the right to speak? Even within the White House, Elellanena did not sit still. Her relationship with Franklin evolved into something more political than personal, a quiet arrangement built on respect, tension, and strategic distance. They lived often apart. She found solace and passion in friendships, especially with women like Lorena Hickok, a reporter whose letters to Elellanena burned with intimacy. Some scholars speculate, others guess. The truth? It is held tightly between the lines of their correspondence in ink that never quite fades. In those years, she became something no first lady had ever been, a mirror to the American conscience. She forced the country to look at itself, not in triumph, but in truth. But behind every truth is a cost. She was ridiculed, called Lady President by those who feared her influence. She was watched, spied upon by the FBI, denounced by racists and reactionaries, but she did not stop, could not stop. Because she had learned, long ago, what silence creates. She had been raised in the vacuum of emotion. She had lived in the shadows of men who collapsed under their own weight. She had been invisible, forgotten, mocked, and yet she endured. Is that not the mark of greatness? Not applause, not power, but persistence. Through the collapse of Wall Street, through the New Deal, through labor strikes and Dust Bowl wins, through the slow, painful birth of a modern America, she walked always toward the edge, not to fall, but to pull others back. And just when it seemed her chapter might close, the world would break again. And Elellanena Roosevelt would not step back. She would step forward into the fire of war and into the cold halls of the United Nations to become something even greater than First Lady. She would become history's witness and its relentless voice. There are moments in history when the world feels like it is spinning toward the edge of something irreversible, when nations tremble, ideologies clash, and the air itself seems to thrum with fear. In the 1940s, the world was on fire. And standing at the edge of that inferno, with her hands open, not in surrender but in service, was Elellanena Roosevelt. When war came, it didn't knock, it kicked the door in. Pearl Harbor, December 7th, 1941. A date carved in steel and ash. As the nation reeled and Franklin addressed Congress with solemn fury, Elellanena did not retreat into ceremonial grief. She boarded a plane. To the Pacific, to the front lines, to the very edge of the war zone. She became the First Lady to travel abroad during wartime, and not for photo opportunities or scripted pleasantries. She went to the hospitals, the airfields, the mess halls. She stood beside soldiers who could barely lift their heads. She listened to nurses who hadn't slept in days. She wrote letters by hand to mothers back home. One commander said her visit did more for morale than a month's worth of supplies. What do you call a woman who walks into the mouth of war without fear? What do you call someone who refuses to stay safe when the world is bleeding? You call her Elellanena Roosevelt. She visited Guadalcanal, Australia, the South Pacific. She spoke with the wounded, held their hands. She gave them something few people could, dignity, a sense that they had not been forgotten. She made them feel visible again. Back in Washington, there were whispers, accusations. Why was she doing this? Who did she think she was? She didn't answer. She never did. Instead, she wrote. In her My Day columns, she described what she saw, without euphemism, without censorship. The smell of burnt skin in a field hospital, the hollow eyes of boys not yet 20, the dirt beneath their fingernails. She didn't glorify war. She didn't justify it. She humanized it. And in doing so, she held a mirror up to the home front. While Franklin strategized with generals and world leaders, Elellanena was reminding the American people what and whom they were fighting for. But there was another war, quieter, older, more insidious, raging inside the country. Segregation, racism. She saw it not just in the South, but in the military itself. Black soldiers sent to die for a country that wouldn't let them sit at the same lunch counter. She visited Tuskegee Army Airfield in Alabama, met with the Tuskegee Airmen, brilliant, brave black pilots whose existence the Army had tried to ignore. She flew with one of them, against military orders, sending a message louder than any speech. They belong. She wrote about it, spoke about it, pushed Franklin harder and harder to address civil rights, even when it risked losing Southern votes. She saw justice not as a theory, but as a demand, and she was willing to pay the price for it. In 1945, that price came due. Franklin D. Roosevelt died on April 12th. Warm Springs, Georgia. A cerebral hemorrhage, sudden, final. The man whose name had dominated a decade of American life. Gone. The nation grieved. But Elellanena, she changed. There was no retreat into widowhood, no disappearing act. She wore black, yes. She mourned, yes. But she had been living her own life for years. She had her own orbit now. And even as the Roosevelt presidency ended, her work, her real work, was only beginning. That same year, something extraordinary happened. The United Nations was born. Out of the ashes of 2 world wars, the nations of the earth gathered to imagine something different. Peace through cooperation, justice through diplomacy. Lofty, yes. Fragile, absolutely. But in those early days, it was a dream worth chasing. And the new president, Harry Truman, looked out across the political landscape and chose someone unexpected to represent America. Elellanena Roosevelt. A woman, a widow, a voice that refused to be quiet. She was appointed as a delegate to the UN General Assembly. Many dismissed her, called her a figurehead, a sentimental gesture. They were wrong. In that chamber of diplomats and doubt, she became a force once again. And within months, she was chosen to chair the UN Human Rights Commission. Her task? To write the founding document of modern morality, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Think about that. A woman born in a world that didn't value her voice, now crafting the very language by which the rights of all humans would be judged. It was grueling work. Nations clashed over every word. The Soviets argued, the French bristled, the British hesitated. Some wanted guarantees, others feared too much freedom. But through it all, Elellanena persisted. She listened, mediated, negotiated with steel in her spine and fire in her voice. She fought to include language that protected the freedom of speech, the right to education, the right to a life without fear. Night after night the sessions dragged on, but she stayed. And on December 10, 1948, in the shadow of war, amid the rising winds of the Cold War, she stood before the world and delivered what may be the most important speech of her life. She said, "Where, after all, do universal human rights begin? In small places, close to home. Such are the places where every man, woman, and child seeks equal justice, equal opportunity, equal dignity without discrimination." She didn't speak in abstractions. She spoke like someone who had walked the hard, quiet road of the forgotten, who had been overlooked, and who had risen anyway. The declaration passed. 48 nations in favor, none opposed. She had done it. But even then she didn't stop. She spent the next decade traveling the world, speaking in crowded auditoriums and echoing assembly halls. She talked about peace, about dignity, about freedom, not as distant ideals, but as daily, living truths. She met with kings, with farmers, with children, with revolutionaries. Her words did not just describe the future, they summoned it, and all the while she returned home each night to a modest apartment in New York City. No guards, no parade, just a desk, a pen, and the unending weight of unfinished work. She never wanted power. She wanted justice. She never asked to be adored. She asked to be heard, and in a world that had tried so long to silence women like her, she became the voice that could not be buried. But history is not done with her yet. Because legacy is not built in speeches, it's built in choices. And Elellanena Roosevelt was not finished choosing. The final years of a life often reveal its truest shape. When ambition fades and crowds go quiet, what remains is the soul beneath the legend. For Elellanena Roosevelt, the twilight of her journey was no soft descent. It was a final ascent into the storm. She had lived through war, through betrayal, through the collapse of empires and the birth of institutions. She had lost a husband, gained a nation's voice, and rewritten the moral architecture of the modern world. But even now, in her 70s, with her hair turned silver and her body growing frail, she refused the comfort of retreat. Why rest, she would say, when there was still injustice in the world? The Cold War had settled over the globe like a poisonous fog. East against West, democracy against tyranny, 1,000 nuclear secrets buried in the soil. And through that fog, Elellanena moved like a lantern-bearer, illuminating what others feared to face. She was no longer an official diplomat. Truman's presidency had ended. Her role with the United Nations had formally concluded. But Elellanena Roosevelt needed no title to speak truth. She had become, by then, a nation unto herself. She took up causes others abandoned. In the 1950s, as McCarthyism spread its black stain over the American political soul, she stood against it. While senators hunted supposed communists through backroom hearings and whispered accusations, Elellanena defended freedom of thought. She refused to name names. She denounced the paranoia, the fear, the weaponization of patriotism. It earned her more enemies, more files in FBI drawers, more threats. But what could fear do to someone who had lived in its shadow her entire life? She kept writing, kept speaking, kept appearing at rallies and in classrooms and on picket lines. One day she would address a university of skeptical young men, many of whom had been taught to see her as a relic. The next day, she'd be in a rural town, holding a child whose family had no food. And in both places, she spoke with the same conviction, that human dignity was not a gift granted by governments. It was a birthright. She remained fiercely independent. She cooked her own meals, took the bus, walked the streets of New York City in shoes worn thin with purpose. The Secret Service sometimes offered her protection. She declined. Who would want to harm an old woman speaking of peace? But she knew better. Hatred never sleeps, it just changes masks. She fought for civil rights even as the country boiled over with racial tension. In Montgomery, Rosa Parks had refused to give up her seat. In Little Rock, black children were being spit on as they walked into school buildings. The movement was rising, and Elellanena stood behind it like a granite pillar. She wrote letters to governors. She challenged editors. She encouraged young activists not to lose faith. They called her the First Lady of the World, but she had always been something stranger, something less elegant and more sacred. She was a witness. She bore testimony. to every woman who had been silenced, to every man who had died in war, to every child who had been locked out of opportunity. She remembered them. Even as her health declined, slowly, then all at once, she pushed forward. Her body began to betray her. Aplastic anemia, weakened marrow. The blood cells that once carried her strength thinned like parchment. But still, she moved through the world with deliberate grace. In 1960, John F. Kennedy, the young and untested senator from Massachusetts, rose to prominence. At first, she was skeptical of his ambition. She had known too many men who chased power for the sake of it. But over time, he won her trust. And she gave him something few others could, the weight of her blessing. She campaigned for him, endorsed him, brought her voice, her influence, her relentless sense of duty to bear for his victory. And when Kennedy asked her after the election to return to the United Nations, this time to work on the President's Commission on the Status of Women, she accepted. One final mission. The commission would investigate the discrimination women faced in law, in employment, in public life. It would gather the data the world had always ignored. And Elellanena, with her failing body and undiminished spirit, chaired its first meetings with the same fire she had carried since girlhood. Do you understand what that means? That a girl mocked by her mother, abandoned by death, betrayed by love, carved by grief had now lived long enough to shape the fate of half the human race. But even fire eventually burns down. In the fall of 1962, Elellanena Roosevelt grew too weak to leave her apartment. Her face still striking, still solemn, still undeniably hers, became pale with exhaustion. The hospital visits grew longer, the silences heavier. She received visitors, but never pity. And when the end came, it did not trumpet. It whispered. November 7th, 1962. She died in Manhattan, in the city where her story had begun. The president sent condolences. World leaders paused in reverence. Newspapers across continents ran her photo on their front pages. But for the millions who had read her columns, heard her voice, or simply felt her presence in the long, slow arc of progress, her death was something more intimate. It was the quiet extinguishing of a lighthouse, a steady glow, gone, but never forgotten. Her funeral was small, modest, as she would have wanted. No marble tomb, no imperial fanfare, just a resting place in Hyde Park, beside the man whose name she helped make eternal, and beside whom she had lived a life both connected and completely her own. Even in death, she did not belong to any one person. She belonged to the idea of what a human being could be, what we might still become. And now, decades later, the question remains. Not what would Elellanena Roosevelt do, but what will we do now that we remember her? Because remembering is not enough. Legacy is not a monument. It is a call. And hers still echoes, waiting for an answer. What does it mean to live a life that outlasts breath? To cast a shadow so long that even the sun must bend around it? Elellanena Roosevelt did not merely pass through history. She carved into it, her words, her will, her wounds, so deeply that even the silence after her death could not swallow her. But the dead do not vanish. They wait. In archives, in headlines, in footnotes, and forgotten letters. And Elellanenna's ghost lives where history meets conscience. In the years after her passing, the world changed. Civil rights laws were signed, walls fell, empires crumbled. Women stepped into offices and courtrooms, and presidencies once closed to them. And in quiet corners of these revolutions, her voice could still be heard, like an echo from beneath the floorboards of time, because she had seen all of it coming, and she had planted seeds in the darkest earth. In 1963, less than a year after she died, the March on Washington unfolded. Hundreds of thousands of people gathered beneath the shadow of the Lincoln Memorial. The words, "I have a dream," soared into the summer air. And though Martin Luther King Jr. never marched beside Elellanena, they were kindred souls. He had once called her a strong and noble woman, and her endorsement of civil rights had given his movement breath before the country was ready to listen. One of her closest allies, Bayard Rustin, had helped organize that very march. A black gay man long silenced by the political machinery of the time, whom Elellanena had defended, written to, listened to, now stood as an architect of American transformation. Do you see the pattern? She lifted those no one else would touch. She listened to voices others tried to bury. And in doing so, she built a legacy not in marble or gold, but in people, in movements, in memories. By the 1970s, her image had faded from the glossy magazines. The newer generation, born into protest and post-war reconstruction, barely knew her name. Textbooks distilled her into a footnote: First Lady, humanitarian, wife of Franklin D. Roosevelt. But that title was always too small. She had worn it like a borrowed coat. Useful, imperfect, never quite hers. Still, she endured. The feminist movement reclaimed her as one of its quiet foremothers. Gloria Steinem once said that Elellanena Roosevelt was one of the first women who taught the world that power didn't have to look like dominance. It could look like compassion, steel wrapped in gentleness. Others resisted her memory. She had challenged too many traditions, pushed too hard against comfort. Her critics called her naive, idealistic. But to those who had walked in her shadow, the nurses, the factory women, the wounded soldiers, the children in war zones, she was something else. A shield, a torch, a witness. In the 1980s, during the Reagan era, her name was evoked again, this time in debates over international human rights. The United Nations, by then a complicated and often dysfunctional arena, still carried traces of her original vision. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, that frail document she had fought tooth and nail to finish, remained the moral spine of the organization. Leaders cited it, activists bled for it. And whenever the world fell short of its promises, and it often did, her words came back. Where, after all, do human rights begin? Not in courts, not in capitals, but in small places, close to home. In the kitchen where a woman is told her dreams are too big. In the school where a child is taught to doubt their worth. In the factory where sweat is traded for silence. This was her battlefield. Not the grand stage, but the ordinary hour. And that's what made her dangerous. Because she reminded us that change does not come from leaders alone. It comes from those who refuse to wait. In the decades that followed, pieces of her life began to resurface. A letter found in a forgotten archive. A diary entry quoted in a feminist thesis. Interviews with those who had worked beside her, who remembered the way her presence filled a room, not with noise, but with weight. One story stood out. A young civil rights worker in Mississippi, jailed for organizing voter registration, once received a care package during her confinement. In it was a bar of soap, a set of pencils, and a handwritten note. It was signed simply E. Roosevelt. She had not advertised it. No reporters had followed. No headlines were printed. Just an old woman in the last year of her life, reaching across the chasm of injustice to say, "I see you." Is that not power? Not to command armies, but to reach one person at the right moment and give them the strength to endure. In time, statues would be built. Scholarships would bear her name. Buildings would be christened with her initials. Presidents and senators and prime ministers would quote her when it suited them. But none of that mattered to her. Not really, because her greatest legacy was never in stone or law. It was an invitation to stand up, to speak out, to refuse the easy answer, and to believe that dignity belongs to all, or it belongs to none. Now, as we look back across the length of her life, across the shadows of war, the corridors of diplomacy, the marches of justice, and the endless ink of her letters, we are left with something most histories cannot offer. A challenge. Will we carry her fire forward, or will we let it die, flickering in the wind of forgetfulness? Because legacies, no matter how mighty, are not eternal by default. They are chosen, revived, lived. So as you sit in the dim light, listening to this voice from the past, ask yourself, when the moment comes and the world turns to you, will you be a spectator, or will you be, like she was, a witness? Because the story of Elellanena Roosevelt is not finished. It lives in every choice you make. There is a silence that comes after a great life ends, not the hush of respect, nor the stillness of mourning, but a silence filled with questions, the kind that echoes long after the applause fades, long after the speeches end. And for Elellanena Roosevelt, that silence has never been empty. It waits, it watches, It asks us to remember not just what she did, but who she really was. Because beneath the titles and tributes, behind the photographs and proclamations, there lived a woman so complex, so deeply human, that history has often struggled to hold her in one piece. We are taught to see her as a saint, but saints don't bleed. Saints don't wrestle with doubt. Saints don't wake in the night and wonder if they were ever truly loved. Elellanena did. She once wrote, "You gain strength, courage, and confidence by every experience in which you really stop to look fear in the face." It's quoted endlessly now, stitched onto pillows, engraved on plaques. But few remember the line that came before it, scrawled in her private notes. There are nights when the loneliness is unbearable. She never said who she meant. Franklin? Her mother? Herself? Even surrounded by admirers, by staff and statesmen, by crowds that surged forward to touch her hand, Elellanena Roosevelt often stood alone. There is a kind of solitude reserved for those who lead with empathy. Because to feel the pain of others is to carry weight you didn't ask for, and no one, not even the most well-meaning, can help you carry it all. She kept diaries, pages filled with sorrow and strategy. She wrote of her fears that the world would move on and forget not just her work, but the reason for it. That the hunger for justice could be dulled by comfort, that people would grow tired of caring. She knew even then that history is not a staircase, it is a wheel, and that every gain is vulnerable to erosion. She had lived long enough to see that cycle. She watched countries rise from ashes only to sow the seeds of new destruction. She watched children freed from poverty only to grow into adults shackled by a different kind of system. And still, she chose to believe in progress. Not because she was naive, but because she had seen what despair could do, and she refused to feed it. But belief came at a cost. She was often misunderstood, portrayed as cold, too serious, too political, not feminine enough, not deferential enough to the men who expected her to fade quietly into the role of widow, grandmother, ex-first lady. She refused. And for that refusal she paid in whispers, in headlines, in subtle acts of erasure. But she endured, because she had something greater than reputation. She had purpose. Still, even purpose can't shield you from pain. Her relationship with her children was never simple. She loved them, of course, but love was not always warmth. She was distant, often distracted. They grew up in the long shadow of the presidency, surrounded by legacy, but starved for affection. Anna, her only daughter, once said that being close to her mother felt like standing next to a flame, beautiful, powerful, but hard to touch. And Elellanena knew it. She wrote to Anna later in life, confessing regret, wishing she'd been softer, wishing she'd listened more. But regret for Elellanena was not weakness. It was evidence of growth. She bore it like a scar, unhidden, unashamed. And in those final years, she tried to mend what had been frayed. With her children, with her nation, with herself. There is one story, rarely told, buried in a dusty interview transcript, of Elellanena visiting a small town in West Virginia just a few months before her death. Coal country, forgotten by prosperity. She was there to speak about education. But when she arrived, she saw the state of things, the hollowed-out homes, the barefoot children, the weary faces carved by generations of labor. Instead of giving a speech, she asked the crowd one question. "What do you need?" The room was silent. No one had been asked that before, not by someone like her. Then slowly the answers came. Food, medicine, a road that wouldn't flood. She sat there taking notes. No fanfare, no photographer. Just an old woman with a notebook and a heart still listening. And before she left, she told them, "No promise tonight, but I'll try and I'll remember." That was her magic. Not policy, not power, presence. She showed up, over and over again, even when she was tired, even when she was alone, even when the world seemed not to care. She showed up because she believed that human dignity was not an ideal. It was a responsibility, and that someone had to answer when it was threatened. Elellanena Roosevelt spent her life answering that call, sometimes with speeches, sometimes with silence, sometimes with nothing more than the choice to stay when others turned away. And now her voice, quiet, persistent, still asks the same question. Will you show up? Will you speak, even if your voice shakes? Will you stand, even if no one stands with you? Because the life of Elellanena Roosevelt was not a monument. It was a door, and it's still open. The older she grew, the more she defied the shape the world had carved for women like her. Elellanena Roosevelt was supposed to fade, to retreat quietly into a respectable widowhood, to write her memoirs and knit for her grandchildren, to smile politely at state functions and let the next generation take the reins. But she refused to vanish. Instead, she intensified. Her edges sharpened, her convictions hardened into bone, and her presence, still tall, still unmistakably her, loomed larger in death's shadow than it ever had in her youth. There was something uncanny about her final years. Not just her stamina, though that alone was staggering. She traveled endlessly, gave hundreds of speeches, wrote thousands of letters. Her syndicated newspaper column, My Day, still reached millions daily, even as her hands trembled more with each page. No, it was more than that. It was how her vision grew clearer as her body weakened. As if mortality had stripped away the last distractions. As if knowing time was closing in, she resolved to stop softening her message. She spoke of racism in blunt terms, of poverty not as a tragedy, but as a crime, of war not as heroism, but as failure. In 1958, she stood in front of a packed auditorium at Brandeis University and delivered one of her most searing speeches. She spoke of the dangerous myth that America was already equal, that democracy could rest on comfort, that justice would arrive if we simply waited. "No one can make you feel inferior without your consent," she said. The audience applauded, but what they didn't hear, what was written in her diary later that night, was her confession. "Sometimes I wonder if the consent we give is silence." That line never made the history books, but it should have, because that was Elellanena''s greatest fear, that we had grown too skilled at silence, too polished at pretending not to see, too willing to trade truth for peace and comfort for complicity. She saw it everywhere, in northern cities that passed laws banning discrimination, but quietly redlined neighborhoods, in universities that championed free speech, then silenced their own students, in leaders who praised her publicly, then dismissed her privately as difficult, too political, too much. But she kept speaking, even when the crowd shrank, even when the applause thinned, even when her voice cracked and her back ached and her closest friends had passed on. Because Elellanena Roosevelt was never chasing approval. She was chasing truth, and truth, she believed, was never owed to the powerful. It was owed to the powerless, and so she spent her last years walking into rooms where she was not invited, testifying before Congress on the plight of the disenfranchised, meeting with grassroots organizers in kitchens, not boardrooms, writing letters to lonely girls in Kansas, to war widows in France, to prisoners in Tennessee. She became something more than a stateswoman. She became a mirror. She held up the image of what we claimed to be and asked, gently but relentlessly, "Is this true?" And if it wasn't, she asked again, then why not? One story survives from those final years, faded with time but still quietly radiant. She had been invited to a private dinner in Washington, a gathering of senators and ambassadors. The table was long, the room dimly lit, the food carefully plated. Beside her sat a rising congressman, a young man with a golden future, groomed for greatness. He turned to her, wine in hand, and smiled. "Mrs. Roosevelt," he asked, "don't you ever get tired of fighting?" She looked at him, long enough that the silence grew heavy. Then she said simply, "What makes you think I ever had a choice?" He laughed. But she didn't. Because for her, the fight wasn't posture, it wasn't politics, it was life. To stop fighting injustice for Elellanena would be to stop breathing. And even as her body began to fail, her spine curved by age, her lungs weakened by illness, her fire refused to dim. Her last overseas trip was to Yugoslavia. She was in her 70s, frail, tired. But she went, because she had been invited to speak on peace. And she believed peace was not a luxury, it was a necessity. She stood at the edge of a bomb-scarred city, and she said this: "Peace begins where fear ends. And fear ends when we see one another, not as strangers, but as kin." That night she coughed until she could barely speak. But she had said what needed to be said, and for Elellanena Roosevelt, that was enough. By the fall of 1962, her body was giving up. She was diagnosed with a rare form of tuberculosis. Her immune system was weak. The doctors tried, but she knew. She began writing fewer columns. She canceled her last tour. Friends came by her modest apartment in Manhattan to sit quietly beside her, unsure what to say. But she didn't fear death. She feared unfinished work. She called one aide to her bedside and whispered, "Make sure they don't forget. The Declaration, the rights, the people, all of it." And then she closed her eyes. Not with dread, but with the calm of someone who had done what she came to do. Elellanena Roosevelt died on November 7, 1962. The country paused. Presidents mourned. Flags were lowered. But the true eulogy was not in the papers. It was in the hearts of those she had touched, quietly, invisibly. The mothers who had dared speak out. The laborers who had organized. The children who had dared to dream bigger than they'd been told they could. And so now, her legacy does not rest in statues. It breathes in anyone who chooses conscience over comfort, who answers the call, and who, like she did, refuses to ask, "Will I be liked?" and instead asks, "What will I stand for?" when it matters most. The question remains, what does it mean to leave a legacy? Not a name in textbooks, not a building that bears your face, not the endless repetition of sanitized quotes across social media feeds, but something real, something felt. Elellanena Roosevelt never wanted to be remembered as an icon. That kind of immortality, she knew, was brittle, shaped by others, hollowed out over time. She once wrote to a friend, "If they ever make a statue of me, I hope they make it weep." Because she didn't want to be worshipped. She wanted to be understood. And yet, understanding her is a challenge. She didn't fit neatly into the world she inhabited. She didn't follow rules meant to keep women small. She didn't soften her words to make others comfortable. And for that, history has struggled to contain her. Some try to cast her as the great humanitarian, a symbol of kindness, a grandmotherly figure of moral clarity. But kindness was only part of her, because Elellanena was also ruthless, sharp, a strategist. She understood the machinery of power, and she used it, not for her own gain, but to pry open the doors for others. She knew how to make men listen in rooms where she wasn't welcome. She knew how to lose battles and win wars. She could be cold, impatient, even condescending. She didn't suffer fools. She held grudges. She distrusted sentimentality. And yet, beneath all that, was a river of love so deep, so vast, that it threatened to pull her under. That's what people didn't always see. She felt everything. Injustice didn't just anger her, it hurt her. She took it personally. When she walked through slums and saw children sleeping on crates, her body tensed for hours. When she read letters from black families turned away from polling places, her hands would tremble. She wasn't moved by pity. She was moved by rage. And from that rage, she drew a rare form of courage, the kind that doesn't ask for applause, doesn't need validation, and doesn't flinch when it stands alone. It wasn't glamorous. Most nights she ended her days exhausted, with stacks of unanswered mail and the ache of futility pressed against her chest. But she kept going. Because the world, she believed, only changed when people refused to abandon the hard work. And her work, after death, was not done. It was picked up in pieces. By civil rights organizers who studied her essays like scripture. By peace activists who quoted her speeches in protests. By young women who found in her story the permission to speak louder, think bigger, demand more. She lived on, not as a myth, but as a method, because Elellanena didn't give us answers. She gave us a model. She showed us how to navigate a world that would rather we stayed quiet. How to listen to the ignored, how to challenge the powerful, how to hold on to our own convictions even when they cost us everything. And perhaps most radical of all, she gave us permission to evolve. Elellanena Roosevelt was not born brave. She was not born noble. She became. Through pain, through mistakes, through loneliness. She stumbled, she misjudged, she disappointed, but she learned. And in that learning, she grew bigger than the box she'd been born into. That's the legacy, not perfection, but the pursuit. The daily, deliberate act of choosing empathy over ego, conviction over convenience, truth over decorum. So now we must ask, what do we do with her memory? Do we reduce her to a quote on a mug? Do we preserve her letters in glass? then ignore what they asked of us? Or do we let her live? In our decisions, in our courage, in the uncomfortable places where conscience stirs and fear whispers, stay small. Elellanena would not have stayed small. She would have stepped forward, even if her voice shook, even if her hands ached, even if no one followed, because that was who she was. Not just the First Lady of the United States, but the First Lady of Resistance and the quiet architect of a better future. Not the kind you dream, the kind you build, one breath at a time, one truth at a time, one unshakable act of love at a time. There's a particular kind of silence that settles in after someone like her is gone. Not the silence of absence, but of expectation, as if the world itself is holding its breath, waiting to see what we will do with what she left behind. Elellanena Roosevelt did not believe in destiny. She believed in effort. She believed that history was not written by the powerful, but by those who insisted on remembering what power tried to erase. And she knew, long before the rest of us did, that memory itself is a battlefield, so she fought to protect it. She fought to preserve the truth in a world that prefers its myths tidy and its heroes simple. But there was nothing simple about Elellanena. After her death, the tributes came quickly. The polished eulogies, the solemn moments of silence, the carefully chosen words that turned a lifelong revolutionary into a grandmotherly figure of goodwill. They said she was noble, graceful, and an inspiration to us all, but they left things out. They didn't mention that she had been followed by the FBI, that J. Edgar Hoover himself had once called her the most dangerous woman in America. They didn't talk about the meetings she took in church basements with black sharecroppers and union organizers, or the nights she spent sitting cross-legged on the floors of tenements, listening, truly listening, to voices that had never been heard before. They didn't say that she had once written a private letter calling white supremacy America's original sin, or that she'd wept behind closed doors after hearing a young Holocaust survivor describe her family's final night. They didn't talk about how alone she often was in those convictions. Even Franklin in his last years had urged her gently to ease up, to choose battles more carefully, to think about her image. She never said it to him, but later she wrote, "I do not care to be remembered fondly if I am not also remembered honestly." That's the part history has always struggled with. Honesty. Because the truth about Elellanena Roosevelt is that she was never easy. She made people uncomfortable. She questioned too much, cared too loudly, pushed too far. And in doing so, she exposed the hollow places in our democracy, the cracks we still paper over with slogans and songs. She knew they were there, because she had stood in them, felt them beneath her feet. And instead of turning away, she asked the question that has haunted generations since. Who exactly is America for? It wasn't rhetorical. She wanted an answer. She spent her final years pressing for one, again and again, in classrooms, in courtrooms, in columns that ran beside the daily comics. She was not trying to shame the nation. She was trying to save it, not with ideology, but with integrity. She believed that patriotism was not obedience, but witness. To see what is broken, to say it out loud, to love your country enough to refuse its lies. And that kind of love, it costs something. She paid with her reputation, with her relationships, with the quiet, domestic life she could have led had she just learned to smile more, speak less. But Elellanena had no use for quiet lives. She was chasing something deeper than legacy. She wanted transformation, and not just in policy, but in people. She believed the greatest human right was the right to be seen, not managed, not tolerated, seen, fully. And she believed that the root of most evil, the rot at the core of prejudice, war, poverty, was fear. Fear of difference, fear of loss, fear of change. She believed fiercely that the only antidote to that fear was human connection, and so she practiced it, one person at a time. She memorized names, held hands, answered letters by candlelight, not because it changed the world in some grand cinematic way, but because it reminded people that they mattered, that they weren't alone, and maybe that was her greatest rebellion. Not the speeches, not the politics, but the refusal to let anyone disappear into invisibility, because Elellanena Roosevelt didn't just stand for rights. She stood for presence, for choosing to see the overlooked, for choosing to care, even when it hurt, even when it was exhausting, even when no one noticed. And that kind of legacy, it doesn't belong in statues. It belongs in us, in how we move through the world, in how we speak to strangers, in the questions we dare to ask, and in the truths we choose to live. Because Elellanena Roosevelt didn't die with her era. She is still asking, still watching, still waiting. Will you listen? The room is quiet now. The voices have faded, the letters have yellowed, the applause has long since stopped. But somewhere beneath it all, something stirs. A pulse, a breath, a memory that refuses to die. Because Elellanena Roosevelt was not meant to be buried in the past. She was meant to echo forward. Through you, through me, through anyone who has ever stood at the edge of silence and asked, what if I speak? This is not the kind of legacy you inherit. It's the kind you answer. And that answer begins with a choice. To see, to feel, to act. She taught us, quietly, relentlessly, that courage is not a moment. It is a posture, a daily discipline, 1,000 small decisions no one else sees. Courage is walking into the room anyway, even when your hands are shaking, even when they've told you it isn't your place, even when history itself tries to shut the door behind you. Elellanena opened that door, and she held it. For generations. She held it for the poor, for the unseen, for the disfigured soldiers and the factory girls, for the black sharecroppers and the immigrant mothers, for the lovers who couldn't speak their names, for the children who didn't yet know the shape of their own voices. She didn't just make space, she taught others how to keep it. And that perhaps is what frightens the powerful most, not the bold figures, but the ones who teach others how to rise. Because once you've seen your worth reflected in someone else's courage, you can't unsee it. And once you've learned that silence is a form of consent, you can't pretend you didn't know. That was her revolution, not loud, but absolute. Elellanena Roosevelt didn't want to be worshipped. She wanted to be continued. So here we are, more than half a century later, still asking the questions she refused to stop asking. Who gets to matter? Who gets to decide? What will you do when the world expects you to shrink? What will you do when injustice feels too vast and the price of caring too high? Will you sit back and say nothing? Or will you, like she did, step into the discomfort? Will you listen? Will you speak? Will you write the letter, join the march, stay in the room? Will you call things what they are, even when no one claps? Because make no mistake, Elellanenna's story is not over. It continues each time a young woman ignores the voice that says she's too plain, too awkward, too late. It continues in the weary hands that keep writing, keep organizing, keep showing up. It continues in every quiet act of defiance that says, you do not have to be powerful to be necessary. You do not have to be perfect to be worthy. You do not have to be loud to be heard. You just have to begin. With clarity, with compassion, with the audacity to believe that the world can be more just if we insist on it. And maybe that's the final truth she left us. That you do not wait for hope, you become it. And when your voice shakes, when the path is dark, when you feel forgotten, dismissed, or alone, remember this. She was there once too, a girl called Granny, a woman told to sit still and smile, a widow standing alone in the shadow of a dead president. And still, she rose. Still she spoke. Still she changed the world. So now it's your turn. Don't wait for permission. Don't wait for someone else to go first. The door is open. She held it. Will you walk through?